Imagine walking into a discount store in the middle of America, past the toasters and the garden hoses, and finding a rack of genuine World War II battle rifles leaning against the wall like umbrellas. No license, no background check, no waiting period. Just cash on the counter and a rifle that had once been carried through the deserts of North Africa or the jungles of Burma, now yours for less than the price of a decent pair of shoes. For nearly a decade, that wasn't a fantasy. It was Tuesday afternoon in thousands of towns across the United States, and then, almost overnight, it vanished. Millions of surplus Lee-Enfield rifles that had flooded American homes disappeared from store shelves, banned by a single piece of legislation signed in the shadow of 2 assassinations. But where did 6 million rifles actually go once the law slammed the door shut? Some were destroyed. Some were hidden. Some are sitting in closets right now, and their owners have no idea what they're actually holding. This is the story of how the guns that won a world war ended up gathering dust in a big box store, and why the government spent the next 50 years trying to make everyone forget it ever happened. Before there was a ban, there was a flood, and almost nobody outside the industry saw it coming. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the rifle itself. The Lee-Enfield had been the backbone of the British Empire's fighting force since before the First World War, refined again and again until the No. 4 Mark I became the standard-issue weapon of British, Canadian, Australian, and Indian troops during the Second World War. It was rugged, fast to reload, and could be manufactured cheaply in enormous numbers once the war machine demanded it. Factories in England, Canada, and even the United States turned out these rifles by the millions, because a world war does not wait for perfection. It waits for volume. By the time Germany and Japan surrendered, the British Commonwealth alone had produced staggering quantities of these weapons, and that doesn't count the additional millions built earlier for the First World War and still sitting in depots decades later. Then the fighting stopped. And a rifle that had been priceless in 1944, worth more than gold to a soldier under fire, became something else entirely in 1946. It became a liability. Warehouses across Britain, Canada, Australia, and India were suddenly bursting with weapons nobody needed anymore. Armies were shrinking, budgets were collapsing, and every single one of those rifles cost money just to store, oil, and guard. A weapon that had been worth a man's life during the war was, within months of peace, worth almost nothing at all to the governments that owned it. That's when a new kind of operator entered the picture. Arms brokers, men who understood that surplus weapons were not garbage, they were inventory, and inventory could be sold. One name looms over this entire story more than any other: Samuel Cummings, a former CIA contractor turned international arms dealer who built a company called Interarm Co., later known as Interarms. Cummings had an instinct that would reshape the American firearms market for the next 20 years. He realized that Commonwealth nations were desperate to unload their surplus rifles for pennies on the dollar, and that the American public, flush with post-war prosperity and a booming hobbyist culture around hunting and target shooting, would happily buy them. So he bought entire national stockpiles, not crates, not pallets, entire arsenals shipped across oceans by the boatload. Once those rifles hit American shores, they needed somewhere to go, and that somewhere turned out to be everywhere. Mail-order catalogs, sporting goods stores, hardware stores, and yes, the discount retail chains that were exploding across the country in the late 1950s and 1960s, chains built on the promise of low prices and high volume, the same business model that made a rack of ex-military rifles fit right in next to fishing rods and camping gear. A rifle that had cost the British government several pounds to manufacture during wartime could be advertised in an American catalogue for less than the price of a movie ticket and a dinner. Some listings advertised Enfields, Mausers, and Carcanos for anywhere between $8 and $30, depending on condition, caliber, and how desperate the importer was to move volume that month. Picture a father flipping through a magazine at his kitchen table, seeing an advertisement for a genuine combat rifle, a piece of world history, priced cheaper than a set of tires. He didn't need a permit. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He filled out a coupon, mailed a check, and within days, a rifle that had possibly been carried across the beaches of Normandy or through the mountains of Italy arrived at his front door wrapped in brown paper and grease. An entire generation of American teenagers got their first rifle not from a gun store, but from the mailbox. This wasn't a fringe business. This was mainstream. Millions of these rifles moved through American commerce over roughly a decade, scattering into basements, closets, hunting camps, and yes, onto the shelves of general merchandise retailers who saw a good margin and a steady customer base of hunters, collectors, and curious first-time gun owners. Some estimates place the total number of surplus military rifles imported and sold through this system at somewhere around 6 million, an almost incomprehensible number of former battlefield weapons quietly absorbed into peacetime American life without a single background check ever being run. But this convenient, unregulated system was built on a foundation that was about to crack, and when it cracked because of a rifle almost identical in spirit to the one sitting in that discount store rack. Then, on a November afternoon in Dallas, everything changed. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated with a rifle that had been purchased through the exact same mail-order system that had put millions of Enfields into American hands. The weapon used that day was an Italian Carcano, ordered through an advertisement in a firearms magazine for less than $20, shipped directly to the buyer with no license, no waiting period, and no way for anyone to have stopped the sale. The country was stunned not just by the assassination itself, but by how easy it had been for a mail-order coupon to put a rifle capable of killing a president into anyone's hands. Congressional hearings began almost immediately. Senator Thomas Dodd, who had already tried and failed to pass gun legislation years earlier, suddenly had the political ammunition he needed. But even that wasn't enough to move the bill through a reluctant Congress. It would take one tragedy layered on top of another before anything actually changed. 5 years later, in the spring of 1968, the country was set on fire twice more. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis in April. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles in June. The political pressure that had been building for half a decade finally broke through. Lawmakers who had resisted gun control for years suddenly found themselves unable to explain to their constituents why a mail-order coupon could still put a rifle in the hands of literally anyone in the country with a stamp and an address. On October 22, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Gun Control Act into law, and one of its most immediate, most consequential provisions banned the interstate mail-order sale of rifles and shotguns to private individuals almost overnight. The exact system that had funneled 6 million surplus military rifles into American living rooms was, in a single afternoon, made illegal. But banning a sales method doesn't erase 6 million rifles from existence. It just stops new ones from moving. And that left an enormous, uncomfortable question hanging over gun shops, warehouses, and retail chains across the country. What do you do with the inventory you already have? The answer to that question is where this story gets genuinely strange. Retailers who had built a modest but steady business selling these rifles suddenly found themselves sitting on stock they could no longer legally move the way they had before. Some rifles that were already on physical store shelves, purchased in person rather than through the mail, could still legally change hands over the counter in many states, at least for a while, because the new law targeted interstate mail delivery to unlicensed buyers, not necessarily every single face-to-face transaction at a licensed retailer. That distinction created a strange gray period, where some stores kept quietly selling off remaining Enfields and Mausers directly to walk-in customers, sometimes marking prices down even further just to clear the shelves before further regulations tightened the rules even more. Bargain hunters who understood what was happening descended on hardware stores and discount chains looking for the last of the surplus rifles, sometimes walking out with weapons priced as low as $7 or $8, a final fire sale on history itself. Other rifles never made it to a shelf at all. Massive remaining stockpiles held by importers like Interarms suddenly had nowhere domestic to go, so a portion were re-exported to other countries where import restrictions hadn't tightened, sold onward to South American militias, African client states, and Middle Eastern buyers who were far less picky about paperwork than the newly cautious American market. Some importers pivoted their remaining Enfield inventory toward the sporting market, having gunsmiths sporterize the old military rifles, cutting down stocks, adding scopes, rebluing barrels, and rebranding them as hunting rifles that could still legally be sold under the tighter post-1968 rules because they were no longer classified or marketed the same way. A rifle that had once stormed a beachhead in Sicily might have spent its second life quietly hunting deer in Michigan, its military heritage sanded away and forgotten. Then there's the darker, less discussed portion of the story: destruction. Rifles that importers considered too worn, too obsolete, or simply too much of a legal headache to keep moving were scrapped outright, cut apart, or deactivated in bulk, their steel recycled and their wooden furniture burned or discarded. Government-held military surplus that hadn't already made it into civilian hands before the ban went through an even more aggressive destruction process in some cases, with officials increasingly nervous about optics after 1968, unwilling to be seen continuing to flood the civilian market with weapons of war, even through legal loopholes. Warehouse inventories that had been counted in the tens of thousands were reduced to scrap metal tonnage in a matter of months, an almost unthinkable waste of historically significant hardware, destroyed not because it stopped working, but because nobody wanted the political liability of it existing anymore. And then there's the inventory that simply disappeared into America's basements, attics, and gun safes, never resold, never destroyed, just quietly kept by the millions of ordinary people who had bought 1 year earlier for a hunting trip or a curiosity and never gave it up. This is by far the largest surviving category, and it is the reason collectors today still find pristine, unfired Lee-Enfields wrapped in the original Cosmoline grease inside old family closets, exactly as they arrived from the mail-order warehouse decades ago. Somewhere in America right now, in a house nobody would ever suspect, there is very likely a genuine World War II battle rifle leaning quietly in a closet, completely forgotten by the family that owns it. But the surplus rifle story hides stranger footnotes than most people ever hear about. Some of the rifles imported during this era weren't standard issue No. 4 Enfields at all, but far rarer variants, including sniper models fitted with No. 32 telescopic sights, factory tested for extreme accuracy, and originally intended only for specially selected marksmen. A number of these ended up mixed into ordinary surplus shipments, sold for the same handful of dollars as a common infantry rifle, without buyers or sellers ever realizing what they actually had. Decades later, some of those exact sniper variants have sold at auction for many thousands of dollars, meaning a handful of very lucky customers in the 1960s unknowingly bought a piece of specialized military history for less than the cost of a tank of gas. There's also the matter of ammunition, because a rifle without cartridges is just a very expensive club, and the same importers who sold rifles by the millions also sold surplus .303 British ammunition by the crate, often packed in the same sealed wooden containers the military had used, some of it decades old and still perfectly functional. Entire garages across rural America once held stacks of unopened ammunition tins that had been sitting untouched since the Johnson administration, forgotten alongside their matching rifles. Then there's the international angle almost nobody talks about. A meaningful percentage of these Lee-Enfields weren't actually British at all in origin. They were Canadian-made rifles from the Long Branch Arsenal or Indian-made rifles produced at the Ishapur factory, weapons manufactured for entirely different armies that ended up funneled through the exact same surplus pipeline into American hands, meaning a rifle bought at a discount store in Ohio might have originally been built for the army of a country its buyer had never even thought about. And there's one more twist that still surprises even seasoned collectors today. When the ban hit, some retailers didn't destroy or dump their inventory at all. They simply stopped advertising it and quietly kept selling it under the counter to regular customers for years afterward, technically within the letter of the new law, but far outside its spirit, because enforcement in the immediate aftermath of 1968 was inconsistent at best. Small-town hardware stores in particular kept moving old surplus stock well into the 1970s, long after most Americans assumed the mail-order rifle era had ended completely. The rifles that vanished from public advertising didn't vanish from commerce, they just went quiet. All of this leaves behind a legacy that still echoes through American gun culture today. The Gun Control Act of 1968 remains one of the most significant pieces of federal firearms legislation in American history, and the mail-order rifle boom that preceded it is a huge part of why it exists at all. Today, surviving surplus Lee-Enfields are prized by collectors specifically because of this strange history, a genuine World War II combat rifle that any hobbyist could once buy for less than a tank of gas is now a documented piece of both military and legislative history. Museums display them not just as weapons, but as artifacts of a regulatory turning point. Collectors seek out original crates, matching serial numbers, and untouched Cosmoline coatings, because provenance from this specific era adds real value. And modern debates about firearm imports, mail-order sales, and mass civilian access to military pattern weapons all trace a direct lineage back to this exact chapter, when 6 million rifles moved through American commerce faster and more casually than almost anyone in government had anticipated, until 2 assassinations forced a reckoning that changed the law permanently. Somewhere out there, a rifle that once belonged to an army fighting a world war is still sitting quietly in someone's home, and its owner has absolutely no idea what it actually is, or what it survived to get there. So the next time you're cleaning out an attic or sorting through a grandparent's old belongings, and you find a long wooden rifle stock with faded stampings and a bolt-action mechanism worn smooth from use, take a second look. It might just be one of the millions of rifles that carried a soldier through the deadliest war in human history, before ending its journey on a discount store shelf for less than the price of a movie ticket. What do you think happened to the ones still out there, undiscovered right now? Let me know in the comments. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you, hit subscribe, because next time we're uncovering the untold story of the weapons that were never supposed to survive the war at all, and the decision that quietly let them slip through anyway.